On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was happier than he had been in years. The American Civil War, by far the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, was finally coming to a close after 4 years of bitter warfare. Just days earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, signaling that the 11 southern states that made up the Confederacy no longer felt they could continue fighting. Nobody had felt the weight of the conflict more than President Lincoln. The previous 4 years had been hell for him. He anguished over the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost. He struggled to put together a team of generals that could lead the Union to victory. He worked tirelessly to lead a government that was often threatening to rupture from within. For several long years it looked as though the Union might lose, and the United States as it had been would cease to exist. And on top of all of that, his son Willie died amid the worst period of the war. But now, finally, Lincoln was able to breathe a sigh of relief. He knew the war was over and the Union had won. He had just won re-election to the presidency a few months before, something he thought was impossible. And while the work before him of bringing the country back together and beginning to heal the wounds of the war was going to be tough, it was nothing compared to the constant bloodshed that had filled the previous 4 years. That Friday evening, Lincoln and his wife Mary decided to attend a play. This bit of personal entertainment was a luxury that the president had not often afforded himself during the war. Now, with his wife by his side, he would spend a relaxing evening watching Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. As President Lincoln sat down in the presidential box late that evening, he undoubtedly felt at peace for the first time in a long time. The weight of the war was finally off his shoulders. For the next few hours, he could forget about the pressures of the presidency. What happened next would change history forever. John Wilkes Booth was a star. He was a member of a legendary acting family and was one of the best-known actors in the country. He had made several national tours as a leading actor in a variety of productions. His talents were recognized as among the best in the world. The Philadelphia Press even called him a natural genius. But Booth had a dark side. He was a well-known admirer of the South. He firmly supported the secession of the Confederate States and their cause in the Civil War. And as the South's fortunes began to turn for the worse in late 1864 and early 1865, Booth decided to try to help them turn things around. In his diary he wrote, quote, "Our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done." He took it upon himself to do that something. He concocted an elaborate plan to kidnap Union President Abraham Lincoln and deliver him to the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. There, the Confederate government would hold Lincoln for ransom in exchange for the release of Southern prisoners of war, or perhaps even for favorable peace terms. However, the kidnapping plan fell apart when Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to the Union on April 9, 1865. The war was all but over. The Confederacy had lost. A kidnapping would be pointless. So Booth changed his plan, and it became significantly more sinister. No longer would he kidnap Lincoln. Now, he would murder him. The plan was not just to murder Lincoln. Booth wanted to throw the Union government into utter chaos. Along with some co-conspirators, he intended to kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. The goal was to cripple the government and cause panic throughout the North. Perhaps that would give the South a chance to regroup and continue the fight. The plot was put into action on the night of April 14, 1865. Booth gave his cohorts their instructions. Lewis Powell, a Confederate soldier who had been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, would attack Secretary of State William Seward in his home in Washington. George Atzerodt, a German-American painter, would kill the Vice President Andrew Johnson. Booth himself would assassinate Lincoln, and he would do so at a place with which he was very familiar, the place where he had performed countless times, Ford's Theater. The end of the war brought tremendous relief to Abraham Lincoln. All that day, April 14th, Lincoln had been extremely happy and lighthearted. Some of those close to him recounted that he was more cheerful that day than he had ever been since arriving in Washington. He and Mary had taken a relaxing carriage ride. During the ride, Abraham happily told Mary that it was time for both of them to rise up out of the misery they had been in due to the war and the loss of their son Willie. One acquaintance said that Lincoln had never seemed more hopeful and buoyant concerning the condition of the country. He went on to say that day Lincoln was full of fun. The President and First Lady were fashionably late for the play, which was already underway when they arrived. Upon seeing them, the crowd erupted into applause, and the play came to a momentary halt. The band struck up a rendition of Hail to the Chief as Abraham and Mary climbed the stairs to the presidential box. There, Lincoln sat in a rocking chair that had been selected especially for him. By all accounts, the president enjoyed the play and the mental escape it gave him. Witnesses noted that Mary often would call her husband's attention to something that occurred on stage, and that she seemed to be very pleased at his enjoyment of the event. Mary even recalled some playful flirtation between the couple that occurred during the play. At one point, she whispered to her husband, asking him what their guests would think about her hanging on him so. He replied that they would think nothing of it. John Wilkes Booth was not in the play that night. However, because he was a very familiar face at Ford's Theater, he had easy access to the building and virtually all the rooms within it. At sometime around 10:15 p.m., Booth slowly walked up to the box where Lincoln was sitting. He wrote something on a card and handed it to an usher, who then allowed him into the box. There were 2 doors to the presidential box, one door which led into an outer room, and then another door which led directly into Lincoln's box. Booth wedged a stick between the wall and the outer door, barricading it from inside. He then approached the inner door and waited for his moment. Booth knew the play by heart, and he waited for a precise moment to make his attack. When this line was delivered by actor Harry Hawk, "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap," the crowd laughed uproariously. Booth took advantage of the loud laughter to open the inner box door, slowly step up behind Lincoln, and fire his gun from point-blank range. The bullet struck the president's head behind his left ear, and then burrowed a hole through his brain before coming to a stop behind his right eye. Lincoln immediately slumped over as Mary screamed. Henry Rathbone, who, along with his fiancée, was a guest of Lincoln's in the box, tried to apprehend Booth, but Booth pulled out a knife and slashed Rathbone on the chest. Booth then jumped over the box's railing onto the stage 12 feet below. As he fell, the spur of his boot caught in the flag that was draped over the front of the box. He landed awkwardly on the stage, and then stood up, apparently in pain, and screamed, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for, "thus always to tyrants." He then ran across the stage and exited a side door, where he had a horse waiting for him. It took a while before the people in the theater realized what had happened. Eventually, Mary's panicked screams told the story. In the presidential box, several concerned people surrounded the stricken president. He did not look good. Just a few blocks away in Lafayette Park, Secretary of State William Seward laid in his bed. He was still recovering from an accident he had been in 9 days earlier, where he had been thrown from his carriage. He was finally beginning to recover, and that day had been his best since the accident. Still, he was confined to his bed with a broken arm and a broken jaw. Sitting next to the bed was his beloved 20-year-old daughter, Fanny. She had been reading to him until he began to fall asleep. At around the same time that Booth was making his way into Lincoln's box, Powell knocked on Seward's door. He told the butler who answered the door that he had medicine for Seward from his doctor, and that he had to give it to him personally. Once he had persuaded the butler to let him in, he began the climb up the stairs to Seward's bedroom, which was on the 3rd floor. At the top of the stairs, he was stopped by Frederick Seward, William's 34-year-old son. Powell gave him the same medicine story, but Frederick was not buying it. He told Powell that the patient was sleeping and could not be disturbed. If the man would give him the medicine, Frederick said, he would give it to his father when he woke up. However, at the same time, Fanny emerged from a room down the hall and contradicted Frederick, saying that their father was in fact awake. Lewis Powell then knew exactly where his intended victim was. Powell pulled a large gun, pointed it at Frederick, and pulled the trigger. Luckily, the gun did not go off. However, he viciously beat Frederick with it, crushing his skull and exposing his brain. He then hurried past Fanny and into the room where the Secretary of State was lying helplessly. There he was met by a Private Robinson, a soldier who was keeping watch over the Seward home. Powell slashed at Robinson, cutting his forehead, and then charged toward his target. William Seward was only half awake when he saw his assassin approach him with a knife. Powell began stabbing him in the face and neck. Thankfully for Seward, he was wearing a splint to immobilize his broken jaw, which likely prevented the blade from slicing his jugular vein. Fanny's screams attracted attention from others, including Seward's other son Augustus, who joined with Robinson to try to stop Powell. Augustus pulled out his own gun, at which point Powell finally retreated and ran downstairs. Approaching the door, he ran into a messenger and stabbed him in the back. The carnage finally came to an end as Powell left the house while screaming, "I'm mad, I'm mad." He ran off into the city of Washington, D.C. The house was in chaos. Robinson helped Seward, who had been pushed onto the floor, back onto the bed. He told Fanny to apply pressure to the wounds to slow the bleeding. Other members of the household searched the rest of the house, desperately hoping there were no other attackers present. In all, 5 people had been wounded in the attack, some seriously. Seward had been stabbed 5 times in the face and neck. At first, he appeared to be dead. His doctor said, quote, "He looked like an exsanguinated corpse." There had been a considerable amount of blood loss. When Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles arrived at Seward's house after hearing news of the attack, they were shocked at the blood that seemed to be everywhere. Welles recalled that Seward's bed was, quote, "saturated with blood." Frederick was also hurt badly, bleeding profusely from his head. The doctor first arrived on the scene was able to slow the bleeding somewhat, but still feared that the young man would not survive. The first 2 parts of Booth's 3-part plan had been put into action. Booth himself had shot the president. Lewis Powell had attacked and grievously wounded the Secretary of State. The third and final part fell to George Atzerodt, who was tasked with the murder of the vice president. His attack was supposed to take place at the same time as Booth's and Powell's. At 10:15 p.m., he was to emerge from the room he was renting in the Kirkwood Hotel and ring the bell of Andrew Johnson's suite in the same building. He was then to push his way inside and shoot the vice president dead. However, George Atzerodt was not a brave man. He had spent most of that evening at the hotel bar getting drunk. He had hoped that the liquor would steel his nerves for the unpleasant task before him. It didn't work. At about 10 p.m., just 15 minutes before the simultaneous attacks were to begin, he changed his mind and left the hotel for good. As chaos ensued inside Ford's Theater, a young doctor in the crowd named Charles Leal pushed his way to the president's box. He laid the very tall president on the floor and began looking for a bullet wound. He could not find it at first. He took off Lincoln's coat and began removing his shirt, desperately looking for the source of blood. At this point, Lincoln was near death. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Finally, Leal found the wound in the back of Lincoln's head. He stuck his finger into the hole left by the bullet. This removed some blood that had coagulated there, which relieved some of the pressure that had been building on the president's brain. His breathing returned to near normal. Things were starting to look a little more hopeful. It was clear to Leal and Charles Taft, another doctor who had joined him in the box, that they could not treat the president at Ford's Theater, with hundreds of frightened and excited people running around. They decided they had to move him to somewhere more private. A suggestion was made to transport Lincoln back to the White House, but the doctors rejected this idea because Lincoln could not survive the carriage ride. Then the owner of a house across the street, called the Peterson House, offered that to them. They hurriedly moved the president across the street. They laid him on a bed that was much too short for his lengthy frame. He was laid across it diagonally so he would fit. Blood immediately covered the pillow where his head rested. After visiting Seward, Secretary of War Stanton and Secretary of the Navy Wells then proceeded to the Peterson house to see Lincoln. They found Mary weeping in a parlor next to the room where the president laid unconscious. Occasionally she would rise, go to her husband's bedside, and be overcome by emotion. She would then return to the parlor. Their son Robert, who had just recently returned from fighting in the war, was also summoned to his father's bedside. Their younger son Tad, who was only 12 at the time, was not brought to the scene. Mary wanted to spare him from seeing his father in that condition. Eventually, dozens of concerned people gathered at the Peterson house. Edwin Stanton took charge of the task of taking witness statements about the event and beginning the search for the perpetrators. It was no secret that John Wilkes Booth had been the president's attacker, but the identity of Seward's assassin was unknown at the time. Seward alternated between grieving at Lincoln's bedside and coordinating the government's response to the emergency. Meanwhile, Lincoln's condition, despite Leal's earlier hope, was rapidly declining. His breathing slowly became more labored and less regular. The doctors would occasionally clear blood clots from the wound, which would temporarily improve his breathing. He lingered for many hours. He was shot before 10:30 p.m., and by dawn the next morning he was still fighting for life. Mary made one final visit to her husband's side around dawn on April 15th. Lincoln's facial features by that time had become distorted due to the bleeding inside his brain. His breathing became extremely faint and low. At times he stopped breathing altogether. A minister who was present led everyone in the room in a prayer. Finally, at 7:22 a.m., after 9 hours of struggling for survival, Abraham Lincoln passed away. Stanton gave a final tribute to the fallen president by saying, "Now he belongs to the ages." By the time Lincoln passed away, Booth was already into the neighboring state of Maryland. Just a few hours after he shot the president, he arrived at the home of Mary Surratt, a friend who had been part of his previous kidnapping plot. He arrived there alongside David Harold. Harold was supposed to be the getaway horseman for Lewis Powell after Powell's attack on William Seward, but he had gotten scared and left early. Now he and Booth were at Surrattsville to gather some supplies for their getaway. The stop at the Surratt house was very brief, likely lasting only a few minutes. Booth stayed on his horse the whole time, as it was clear by that point that his leg was broken from his jump onto the stage after the assassination. Harold picked up a pair of binoculars and a gun that had been stashed there earlier. Then the pair continued on their escape route. Next, Booth and Harold stopped in Waldorf, Maryland, just a few miles from Virginia. There they stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. It is still not clear how well Mudd knew Booth, his intentions, or the fact that he had just murdered the president. It is known, however, that Mudd was a Confederate sympathizer and had met Booth previously. Dr. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and gave the pair a place to rest. After about 12 hours, they continued on to Rich Hill, Maryland, which was the home of another Confederate sympathizer named Samuel Cox. Cox and his son arranged for the murderous pair to meet with Thomas Jones, who would help them cross the Potomac River into Virginia. Though the trip from Rich Hill to the Potomac was short, it was also very difficult. They traveled through thick brush and forest, and it took them 4 long days. During this time, Booth began writing in his diary. He also read newspapers that were brought to him by Jones. Amazingly, Booth was surprised that the country was not hailing him as a hero. He was angry that the papers were calling him a coward and a villain. When Booth and Harold finally made it to Virginia, they passed through the homes of several sympathizers. Some of these people fed the pair, but they would not let them stay the night because they knew who they were and what they had done. Finally, they came to the house of a free black man named William Lucas. Lucas also refused to give them boarding, but Booth was no longer in a mood to cooperate. He forced Lucas at knife point to let them inside while Lucas and his family slept on the porch. The next morning, they got back on their horses. On the afternoon of April 24, 1865, they arrived at the farm of Richard Garrett. Their intention was to hitch a train ride to Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, where they hoped to find permanent safety from Union troops who were hot on their trail. However, perhaps from exhaustion, they stayed at the Garrett farm for several days. For Booth, this would prove to be a fatal blunder. After Booth and Harold had spent some time at the Garrett farm, Richard Garrett began to grow suspicious of his unexpected guests. When he told them they could no longer stay in his house, they went out back and settled into his tobacco barn. Garrett's sons then locked them into the structure. The next day, the Union troops finally caught up to the assassins. Soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry surrounded the barn where Booth and Harold were sleeping. Harold immediately surrendered. Booth decided he would try to fight his way out, or die trying. Eventually, troops set fire to the barn, hoping to smoke Booth out alive. However, Sergeant Boston Corbett apparently had other ideas. He had been watching Booth from outside the barn, and when he had a clean shot, he took it. Corbett's bullet hit Booth in the neck, paralyzing him. Corbett was later punished for shooting Booth without orders. Booth was then dragged out of the barn to the porch of Garrett's house. He laid there for 3 hours before dying. Reportedly, just before he died, he asked someone to raise up his hands so he could see them. Looking at them in disdain, he said, "Useless, useless," before passing away. Lewis Powell, who had viciously attacked William Seward and 4 others, straggled behind Booth and Harold. He arrived at Surratt's house on April 17th, 2 days later. By that time, there were already Union detectives at the house. While he claimed to be working for Mary Surratt, she denied this, and Powell was arrested. Police also tracked down George Atzerodt, who had failed to carry out his part of the plot to kill Vice President Johnson. He was found at the home of a cousin in Maryland. Eventually, Mary Surratt was also arrested for her part in the assassination. While it is still not clear how much she knew or when she knew it, she was put on trial nonetheless. In July 1865, Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt were convicted of conspiracy to assassinate the president. All 4 of them were hanged the next day. Samuel Mudd was also convicted as part of the conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. He was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson in 1869. William Seward managed to recover from his wounds. It is likely that the splint on his neck saved his life. At first, news of Lincoln's death was kept from Seward for fear of worsening his condition. However, when he noticed that the president had not visited him for several days, and that a flag outside his house was at half-staff, he guessed what had happened. He then laid down on his bed and wept bitterly. Seward would continue in his role as Secretary of State for 4 more years. He is remembered as one of the finest statesmen in American history. He would retire from public life in March 1869 and spent the rest of his life at his home in New York. Frederick Seward's condition after the attack was much worse, and he was not expected to survive. Miraculously, he did. He would go on to serve in the New York State Assembly and as Assistant Secretary of State of the United States. He died in 1915 at age 84. William Seward's daughter Fanny, although not injured in the attack, was nonetheless deeply affected by it. She died just a year and a half later in October 1866. Andrew Johnson, who was never attacked because George Atzerodt lost his nerve, became president upon Lincoln's death. He would oversee the post-war Reconstruction period. Many believe that he mishandled Reconstruction and that if Lincoln had lived, the nation's wounds would have healed much faster. Abraham Lincoln is regularly listed as among the greatest presidents in American history. He is almost universally respected for winning the Civil War, maintaining the Union of the United States, and most importantly, for ending slavery in America. General Grant called him, quote, "incontestably the greatest man I ever knew." Abraham Lincoln was a steadfast, gracious, and brilliant leader whose life was taken far too soon.